So, this is the outline for the American Revolution lecture for today. What do you need to know? Well, I'm going to talk about how this actually happened, how the two peoples that seemingly were getting along rather well, Americans and the British, needed to get away from each other. Then I want to talk about what were the specific roots that led to actual violence between the two sides, how it escalates into resistance, full-on revolution, and finally some of the problems of the new republic, which is what America was, a republic, a government without a king. All parts of the government are elected by the people, president, Congress, etc. Now, how does it get started? We've been doing a lot of talking. You've been doing a lot of work on the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, so on and so forth. All right? You've been looking at a lot of stuff, talking about how do we improve the quality of life for humans on this planet now, and not waiting for the afterlife. So you read John Locke, you read Voltaire, you looked at Rousseau, Adam Smith, Beccaria. You looked at all these guys that said, what are we doing now? Does it work? If not, how do we change it? The most important thinker that you looked at was John Locke. This is the guy that said you have to separate church and state, because if you bring them together, you have a lot of violence. This is also the guy that said all governments exist for the people, to protect their natural rights, life, liberty, property. If these governments, for whatever reason, stop doing that, they in fact hurt the people can just get rid of their government. This was the foundation of the glorious revolution in England that got rid of King James II. This is what the Americans were taught was the way a government is supposed to operate. The people elect representatives that have the right to pass laws that the people have to follow. And if the people's government becomes exploitive, the people can choose a new government. So, all of these ideas of the Enlightenment are now being put into practice in the American Revolution I'm going to talk about today, and the French Revolution I'm going to talk about next class. All people are born with basic natural rights, life, liberty, enjoyment of your property. Everyone is born equal to these rights. They all have them. All people have the right to choose their own government that represents their interests. All people have the right to practice whatever faith they want without any government opposition. And ultimately, freedom. The basic desire of all people is freedom. The government they live under, the economic system they live under, the criminal justice system they live under. All of these things have to have at its basic foundation the freedom of the individual to make a decision. That you are responsible for your own decision. You choose your own government. You choose to break a law, and so you willingly accept the risk of punishment, and so on and so forth. Well, how does all this work in practice? Well, messily. You can't transform the modern world into full democracy and equality in a time where people are divided by race, by class, by gender, by religion. There's going to be pushback. And it starts in America. And it starts off with something that's rather simple: money. The British fought a war against France called the 7 Years' War, which took place not only in Europe, but it also took place in the North American continent. Here it was called the French and Indian Wars. British troops against French troops. Both sides had allies amongst the Native Americans. The only thing you need to know is that the British won. And it was an expensive war, but they won. They defeated the French. Right now, the only French-speaking part of North America is Quebec in Canada, and those parts of Louisiana where they speak a mixture of French, Caribbean, English, or Cajun. But that's it. Before, the French had most of Western America, along with the Spanish. But after this war, it was all Britain. But the British were bankrupted by this war. So they had to raise money. And they couldn't tax their own people to raise that. They couldn't tax their own people enough to raise money. So they did the next best thing. They taxed the American colonists. And the assumption was simple. We fought this war against the French in order to protect not only Britain at home, but also British possessions overseas, the 13 American colonies. You owe us this money. So a couple of taxes were passed in Britain by the British Parliament, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and the monies for these taxes were collected in America. They were paid for by Americans, but the money wasn't spent by the American governments. It was sent back to Britain. Now, the one that I want to focus on is the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act affected everybody, rich and poor, men and women, north, south, farmers, workers. Everybody had to pay it. And it was a simple tax. Every legal paper document had to have an official stamp on it. This official stamp cost you money. Where did this money go? It went back to Britain. Stamp tax. For the first time in Americans' histories, they were paying a tax they didn't vote for. Americans were happy paying taxes to their own governments, city governments, colonial governments, which they voted for. They were happy making donations to their churches, wherein they elected the clergyman. They weren't happy paying a tax to a group of people in Britain, 3,000 miles away, they didn't elect. This is a map that shows you what America looked like before and after the 7 Years' War. Here, you've got the original 13 British colonies in America, their possessions in Canada. Then you have the French that had most of the Great Lakes, everything along the Mississippi River, and the Spanish who have Florida, the Caribbean, Texas, Mexico, and the far west, California, etc. After the 7 Years' War, the French are no longer in North America. The British have taken over everything to the Mississippi River, and the Spanish have been given the rest of the territory after the Mississippi River. The French get it back, but not for a few years. Yeah.
Why did they give us this?
They didn't. What? Why did the French give this to the Spanish? The Spanish?
Yeah, the Spanish gave us the French.
Money.
Oh yeah, that's what we said.
Yeah.
I thought you said like giving like taking it for free.
No. It's the land was exchanged, but eventually given back to France. Now, the size of the victory of the British is staggering. There is no more French possessions in the New World, but this costs money. And this is why the taxation. Now, here are the different perspectives. To the British, it was pretty straightforward. You, people of New York, New Jersey, the Bahamas, whatever, you are part of the British Empire. We, the British Navy, the British Army, fight to protect your freedoms. Every once in a while, we need you to help us pay that debt. And just because you didn't vote for it directly, it doesn't matter. The British Parliament represents your interests. So it's like democracy, because we're thinking about your interests, even though you didn't vote for the members of Parliament that passed these laws. The Americans had a vastly different perspective. To them, they believed in real democracy, meaning I vote for people who I give power to pass laws which I then have to follow. Laws like raising taxes. If I don't vote for that person, I don't have to listen to that person. End of story. That's real democracy. Well, why this difference of opinion? The difference is, in Britain, it's a very limited view of democracy. In Britain, less than 10% of the people have the right to vote for members of Parliament. because you have to have a certain amount of wealth to have the right to vote and property. In America, virtually all white men own property. Farmers, they own their shops in the cities, so they have the right to vote. So you have the same rules. Property equals the vote. But in America, most men have property and they vote. So the expectation is that democracy is a wide thing, not narrow. They expect to actually go to the ballot box, cast a vote, and whoever wins the election, they have to follow that person's decisions. The other reason for the difference of perspective is the Americans got used to this, salutary neglect, which is straightforward. Salutary neglect means the Americans got used to being left alone. The difference between America and Britain is about 3,000 miles. It takes a few weeks to travel from New York to London by boat. Even further if you're going from London down to Georgia. Yeah, that's the furthest southern colony. So the British couldn't possibly manage their American colonies on a day-to-day basis. They had to leave it to the Americans to run most of their stuff by themselves. And the Americans did. They elected their own governments. They built their own roads, bridges, schools, churches. They raised their own taxes. They even protected themselves with their own militias. Now, all of a sudden, the British come in, and they are actively, on a day-to-day basis, instructing you on how to live your life. The Americans aren't used to this. They find it illegal, unfair, new, and inappropriate. Yeah. Because they never paid taxes to the British before. They only pay taxes to their own government. So, the other reason why the Americans had such a different point of view is because all that stuff that happened in England, Caroline, focus up here. All that stuff that happened in England, the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights, John Locke, who says all people have the right to overthrow their government, the Americans took this stuff seriously. They read John Locke, and it said, the government can overthrow their government, people can overthrow their government if they feel they're being exploited. They took that stuff seriously. They also, during the Enlightenment, you remember people like Voltaire, who argued that organized religion is problematic. And you remember Rousseau, that argued that democracy is what all governments should aim for, making sure all people's voices are heard. Well, during the Enlightenment, there was increasing discussion that absolute monarchy is bad. It corrupts governments and it hurts the people. But over time, people started having republican ideals, meaning it's not that there's good kings and bad kings. All kings are bad. Why? Because you don't elect a king. If kings are not responsible to the people, they can do whatever they want. The best system of government is a republic, where the people elect all parts of their government, like the Americans have now, today. So what happened? The Americans were pissed off. And not simply because of these abstract political theories of we've never paid taxes before, and we believe in, we're increasingly feeling monarchies are corrupt. Some of this just came down to money. At the time that the British were imposing new taxes, the Americans were going through a recession. The war was over between Britain and France. All those British soldiers that were in America fighting, they were also buying things from American merchants, farmers, etc. Well, all those soldiers went home when the war was over. So now you had all these American merchants with factories full of stuff that nobody was buying, stores, shelves full of stuff nobody was buying. Farmers had all this produce that nobody was buying. So there was a recession. And now the British come and say, we want you to pay a new tax. So the Americans were pissed off on a political level and an economic level. The most organized protesters were known as the Sons of Liberty. Boston working class men that simply organized themselves to resist the stamp tax. Its leader, Sam Adams. And if you know anything about beer, the Samuel Adams Brewing Company, this is the guy. After he helped win the revolution, he formed a brewing company, or it was at the same time. Now, what did these guys do? They essentially vandalized the offices in charge of collecting these taxes. They made it physically impossible to collect the taxes that the Americans didn't want to pay by destroying the offices where the collection was supposed to take place. But the other thing that these guys did was they took the resistance, which was a political resistance at the upper levels, and they brought it down to the streets. Because people like Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, these guys were not elected officials. They were just regular people who said, we're pissed off, we do believe that we're being treated unfairly, and we're becoming politically active in the only way we know how. We are vandalizing British tax offices. The rebellion is becoming more democratic. It's not just the elites, it's the people that are getting involved. Which means it's going to be more extreme, because the people tend to have an expectation that if they struggle for something, they're going to get something back. So how does this go from being upset to resistance? Representatives of most of the colonies get together and they meet at what's known as the Stamp Act Congress, or meeting, 1765. They get together for the first time and they discuss what they have in common. Now remember, all of these colonies, they didn't consider themselves as Americans. They considered themselves as New Yorkers, Georgians, New Jerseyans, Vermonters, etc., etc., etc. And they all considered themselves loyal members of the British Empire and subjects of King George III. This is the first time they ever got together in the same room and said, what do we have in common besides language, religion, and political systems? Well, we have a common problem. And there's nothing that brings people together like having a common enemy. And this is the common enemy. So, they argued about how do we resist the British? How do we fight back against this unfair tax? Well, we don't want to go to war, but the British impose this tax because they need money, because they're broke. How do we push back? Stop buying British-made materials, British goods. We're their best customers. If we stop buying British-made goods, we will punish them economically. This was incredibly effective, especially when you have people like the Sons of Liberty going store to store to store, making sure that there are no British products on the shelves. And if you buy British products, you're harassed by people like the Sons of Liberty and other unorganized groups of people. What did the British do? They cave in. They don't push the stamp tax because the Americans have become organized against them. But they still need money. So now they take it to the next level. They pass a law called the Quartering Act, placing British troops permanently in America in order to enforce the collection of British taxes in America. Now, a year later, they pass a new law, the Townshend Acts. Technically, this is not a tax on Americans. It's a duty, meaning when products from Britain are unloaded in American ports, a customs duty is collected. That extra money, that extra cost, is passed on to the consumer. So for instance, if you wanted to buy glass, paper, paint, or tea that came from another part of the British Empire, it would now be more expensive to you in the store because of these duties imposed at the port. Now, the Americans recognized that this was essentially an invisible way of taxing them without their permission. It was money being taken out of their pocket by a law Americans did not vote for. So again, they got organized, they boycotted British goods, and they forced the British to reconsider their ideas. But then this happened. The Boston Massacre of March 1770. Let's think about the situation. Yes. Sorry? What was the ideas that they wanted to enforce?
Yes, so the Americans met the British by they had ideas and they wanted them to enforce those ideas.
The Americans haven't met with the British yet. They met with each other in order to convince the British that these taxes, which the Americans did not vote for, were illegal, and they should reconsider them and basically stop taxing the Americans. Okay? In March of 1770, something called the Boston Massacre took place. And this is why. In Boston, this is the heart of the rebellion. This is the most organized anti-British sentiment in the 13 colonies. This is where Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty are organized. Now you have British troops stationed in major American cities like Boston, and they're there to collect unpopular taxes. So the tensions between the Boston people and the British troops are going up. In March of 1770, an argument breaks out between British soldiers and just some regular civilians in downtown Boston. It starts off pretty simply, but there's a lot of frustration. Voices are raised. It's the middle of the winter. Eventually somebody, in the middle of all this tension, throws a snowball at the soldiers. The soldier overreacts. He feels he's being under attack. He opens fire. Other soldiers think the order has been given to open fire, and now you have soldiers firing on defenseless men, women, and children who were simply yelling. The press gets wind of this, and they write the story as the massacre of Boston unarmed civilians. The story spreads throughout the country, and anti-British sentiment goes through the roof. The British are forced to get rid of the Townshend Acts. All those duties on paper, paint, and glass, because the Americans are so frustrated and angry. But they kept the one on tea. But the tension keeps going up. The Americans get even more organized. Now they create what's known as committees of correspondence. And these were nothing more than people writing letters to each other across America, the American colonies, and saying, what is going on in your state, your colony, your city, your town? How are you resisting the British? What are they doing there? There's an increasing national identity. Can I take your phone? Now, this is how you have a revolution. You go from just talking to developing a common identity, which means you are different from the enemy. Now, this is what people would look at when they opened up their newspapers. This is the drawing of the Boston Massacre. It wasn't anywhere near this bad, but it's basically true. Soldiers firing on defenseless civilians that are obviously not armed. They were just protesting verbally. This was incredibly powerful for shaping anti-British sentiment amongst the Americans. They didn't want independence yet, but they were increasingly anti-British. And then the British did something which they should have known was going to lead to trouble. They passed another law to try and raise money on the Americans illegally, according to the American point of view. The Tea Act. And the Tea Act was another one of these underhanded ways to get money out of the Americans that they didn't vote for. And it was simple. The Tea Act said only one company, the East India Company, will be permitted to sell tea in the American colonies. And there will be a tax collected on, or a duty collected on this tea, which will go to the British government. Now, the British East India Company is in fact not an independent company. It's a company that is closely allied with the British government. A. B. Tea at that time was the most common beverage. So like the Stamp Act that affected all people, regardless of where they lived, how much money they had, etc., the Tea Act was going to affect everybody. And everybody was pissed off. So, on December 16, 1773, in Boston, the first ships arrived from the British East India Company filled with this tea. Bostonians dressed up in disguise, stormed the ships, overwhelmed the crew, grabbed the tea, and threw it into Boston Harbor, destroying God knows how much money, how much British property. This is the first time this had ever happened. Actual physical destruction of British property, interfering with British trade. So the British decided to push back. They got fed up, they're still bankrupt, and they simply cannot allow Boston to interfere with British policy, British trade. So the British Parliament passes a series of laws called the Intolerable Acts, meant to punish the city of Boston and set an example that anybody else in America that resists British policy will meet a similar fate. So the port of Boston was shut down, crippling the economy. The government of Boston and Massachusetts shut down, taken over by British royal officials. Most importantly, British troops that were there, taking away people's government, shutting down the ports, and enforcing the collection of an unfair tax, these troops were now being placed into the homes of Bostonians, where you had to, as an owner of a Boston home, take somebody into your home, give them a bed, feed them, do their laundry, and these people, these soldiers, were sent to take away your life, your liberty, your government, your property. So the frustration was running high. And now the tipping point happens and you get into revolution. Because now it's not just people are upset. People are talking about how do we stop this? How do we get really organized? So they come together in Philadelphia, representatives of all the colonies, again, just like they did with the Stamp Act Congress. This time it's all the 13 colonies, and they say, what are we going to do? Because if they could shut down Boston, they can shut down any other city or colony in America. Well, what can we do? Well, why do we do what we've been doing up until now? Boycott British goods. But let's go further. Let's actively engage with the British government and say to them, you cannot do this to one of our cities, to one of our colonies, to one of these, to our people. So there's active negotiation between the Americans and the British. But the British are fed up now. They've been trying to raise money since the Stamp Act of 1765. This is now 10 years later, and the Americans have resisted every single attempt. And now they're actually destroying British property. King George III is fed up. He doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to punish Boston, punish Massachusetts. He wants to arrest the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, all these rebels. He wants to crush resistance. So diplomacy fails. The tension keeps going up. The Americans recognize war is coming. So they start collecting weapons because they know the war is coming and they're going to fight against the British Army, the best in the world, and they got nothing. So they start collecting weapons secretly, hiding them. The British find out. They go looking for these weapons. So the Americans come together, Bostonians and volunteers from the other colonies, to resist the British at two battles, at the cities of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. This is the first time blood is shed in the American Revolution. At this point, no talking is going to avoid a war. They meet again at the Second Continental Congress, the Americans, in Philadelphia in May of 1775, and they decide we need an army. We need an army. War is coming. Who's going to run it? This guy, George Washington of Virginia, slaveholder, plantation owner, well revered across America, especially in the South. The reason a Southerner is chosen is because the northern colonies want to make sure the southern colonies unite together to resist the British. All the fighting is happening in Boston so far. If you want to bring the southern colonies, Virginia, North and South Carolina and Georgia, into this, appoint a Southerner in charge of the Continental Army, which is the American Army. But do they want independence yet? No. People are upset, they're afraid, they're concerned, but they don't want independence yet. Until this guy, Tom Paine, publishes a small book called Common Sense in January of 1776. Tom Paine, with his one book, has had more effect. The only other person that has had this much effect by authoring one small book is Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto. What's that? We do this before we get to class. You need to go? In the future, do it before class. Prop open that door, please. Now, this guy, Tom Paine, wrote this small book in January of 1776 that argued one simple point. You can't talk to the British, we're different people. They believe in monarchy, we believe in full democracy. We believe in electing every level of our government. They don't. They have kings which are unelected, they have nobles which are unelected, and unelected governments lead to corruption. We don't need to be a member of the British Empire, we can survive on our own. And that is the only way for us to preserve our freedom, is to be independent, to be a republic, a government without a king. Now this small book, which if you were to read today, is written in language so straightforward, so commonsensical, that nobody was confused by the message. And the message spread like wildfire, not just by people who bought the book, but by people talking about the book. All of a sudden, people were now talking about independence like, yeah, why are we still talking with these people? The British. So eventually, on the 4th of July, 1776, a few months later, the Second Continental Congress sits down, writes, Thomas Jefferson does most of the writing, the Declaration of Independence, and they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They have certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when governments, and now I'm paraphrasing, when governments no longer protect these rights, the people have a duty to overthrow this government. The Declaration of Independence explains why Americans must overthrow the British government, and they do. So now the war is on, and it lasts until 1781. That's the actual fighting. The peace is finally signed 2 years later. But the actual fighting is between 1776 and 81. Benjamin Franklin is in charge of, he's the ambassador, American ambassador to France. He's in charge of helping to get the French to come in on the American side. Because the Americans in the first few years of war are losing. Because you have to understand the circumstances. The American army is brand new, basically untrained. The American army is poor. They don't have all that much money. It's incredibly small. It's a bunch of amateurs. George Washington is a professional soldier, but most of his troops, they start off the war as amateurs. The British Army is a professional, well-trained, well-funded army that has got lots of experience fighting other professional, well-trained armies. So, the British have got the military advantage, but the Americans have got the geographic advantage. They know the land. They know the roads, the forests, the hills, the caves, the mountains. They have allies. Even if you're not actively in the American army, you have the support of most of the American people. So, in the first few years of fighting, the British couldn't defeat the Americans because George Washington never gave up. He lost virtually every battle he fought, but he never gave up. He just kept retreating, regrouping, and fighting again. The British kept pouring in more and more troops, spending more and more money. And remember, the British were bankrupt even before the American Revolutionary War started. But here's the thing. Because the Americans were never defeated in those first few years of war, other nations started looking to the Americans and thinking, these folks might actually survive the Americans against the great British Empire. What other nations have a beef against the British? Well, there's the French that were defeated in the 7 Years' War, and they wanted payback. But the Spanish were also defeated in the 7 Years' War, and they wanted payback. So now they ally with the new American government. They give them money. The French and the Spanish use their navies against the British Navy. The French send over some troops. Now all of a sudden, Washington's got money, a professional navy, and military allies against an increasingly exhausted British government and army. In 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, Virginia, the Americans and the French corner a large British army and force it to surrender. Now, the British had other armies, they had other troops, they could have kept fighting. But the very fact that the Americans could defeat and capture an entire British army convinced the British people back home, why are we still fighting this? We're never going to win. So enough already. Let the Americans go. They want to be independent, let them go. 2 years later, in 1783, America is finally recognized as independent by Britain, the Treaty of Paris. And this is basically what we look like. These are the original 13 colonies. This territory was controlled by Britain. All of this is Spanish Louisiana so far. After the war is over, the British are just simply kicked out of the West. The Americans took over all the land all the way to the Mississippi River. So, before I finish this off, any questions about anything I've talked about so far? The roots of the revolution, how it developed, the various steps, etc. Any questions at all?
What allies had to be of Americans or what did they do? Like you said, they had a
The Spanish and the French?
yeah.
Troops, navies, money, supplies. Other questions? All right. So America is now independent. Everything should be fine and dandy, but it's not. Why? Because the new American government is broke, and they don't know how to fix their problems. What's their problem? Well, the war is over, and America falls into not just a recession, but a depression. Why? Because they're no longer part of the British Empire.
They don't know what to do now.
No, they don't have the same customers as before. When they were part of the British Empire, they could trade with Britain, African colonies, Caribbean colonies, all over the world. They were part of the British Empire and they could trade in the British Empire. Now they're kicked out. They can trade with France. They can trade with Spain. But the British Empire is the biggest one on the planet, and all those business relations are now cut. The British said, you don't want to be part of the British Empire, you cannot trade with anybody in the British Empire. So trade slows down. Congress, the Continental Congress, which is the only national government the United States has. Remember, at this point, America doesn't have a president. It doesn't even have a Supreme Court. The only national government it has is the Continental Congress, with each state equally represented. Whether you're tiny Delaware or big Virginia, every state is equally represented. And to get a law passed, you need 2/3 of the Continental Congress to get it passed. What's that? Oh, that's later, after the Constitution. So you have this system, the Continental Congress, where all the states are equally represented, and to get anything passed, you need an overwhelming majority, but nobody agrees on anything. Because what's good for Delaware is not good for Virginia. What's good for Massachusetts is not good for Georgia. So, that's one thing. They don't agree on anything. The second thing is, the Continental Congress doesn't have the ability to raise money. Right now, our National Congress, when they raise taxes, they have the right to raise taxes, national taxes, income taxes. This national government didn't have that right. They were not allowed to raise taxes. Only the state governments and the city governments were allowed to raise taxes. So then how do you pay for national problems? Like an army, a navy, to build roads that connect all the states together. You can't. You don't have any money. Only if the states donate money can you do that. And the states aren't doing it because they have their own problems. So now you don't have a real national army, so American territory is undefended. You don't have a real national navy, so American trade is undefended. American debts are not being paid, so nobody wants to lend money to America because they don't know if they're ever going to get their money paid back. It is a mess. Weak central government, weak army, weak navy, weak trade, weak. In the middle of a depression. And in a depression, people are losing money. And eventually, when you can't pay your debts, if you're a property owner, you lose your land. Farmers, in the midst of this depression, were losing their land because they couldn't pay off their rent or their mortgages to their banks. But many of these farmers were veterans of the war. And their argument was, I fought for independent America. The government owes me. They can't take my land because I can't pay my bills. So in western Massachusetts, in 1786, farmers organized around a veteran named Daniel Shays. And they fought against the banks. They fought against the Massachusetts government that's going to take away their land. This rebellion was so well organized that the government actually had to mobilize militias to go in there and put it down violently. This wasn't just a few guys marching in the town square. This was an open rebellion against law and order. This scared the bejesus out of people. Because the only way government works is that everyone respects the laws, respects taxes, etc., and follows them. Not just whatever laws they feel like, but all of the laws. So, the American political elite got together again in Philadelphia. This is in 1787, right after the Shays Rebellion. And they talked about the fact that you have this national government that is poor, that is weak, that needs to be strengthened. It needs to strengthen the economy, strengthen national defense, strengthen law and order. Because if you don't have law and order, you can't have real freedom. That's the argument. And it's basically true. If you don't have certain rules, you just have anarchy, and then everybody is at risk. So they get to Philadelphia, and at first, they don't even want to create a new constitution. They just want to fix the one they have. But when they start talking about it, they realize, you can't fix this. It's completely bad from the beginning. You got to start from scratch. What do we need? Well, we need a strong national government. We need a president, an elected president. We need an executive branch. Okay? We need a Congress that has the power to raise taxes. Okay? We need a Supreme Court. We need checks and balances so this new powerful central government doesn't become corrupt. Okay, everybody agrees on everything. So what do they disagree on? Congress, the legislature. This is where it gets tricky. America is made up of big, wealthy states, Virginia, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, but it's also made up of smaller, poorer states, Delaware, Rhode Island, Georgia. In the existing system of government, all the states are equally represented in Congress, but that's not working. The big states are unhappy because they want more power, and the small states don't want to give up equal representation. So they can't agree on what the new Congress should look like. James Madison of Virginia comes up with a Virginia plan, who says Congress should be represented in the same way as the amount of people are in each state, meaning Virginia has more people than Rhode Island, so Virginia has more representatives in Congress than Rhode Island. That's only fair. The big states love that idea. The small states said, no, we're not going to go for that. And unless you have our support, none of this is getting enacted into law. The small states came up with what's known as the New Jersey Plan, which was just equal representation, keep what we have. And the big states said, no, we already have that, it's not working, and it's unfair. So the folks from Connecticut came up with what's known as the Connecticut Compromise. Split the difference. Give something to the big states, give something to the small states, everybody's happy, everybody votes, we get a new constitution. And the Connecticut Compromise is what we have today. Every state has got equal representation in the Senate, today's Senate. Every state has got 2 senators. But in the House of Representatives, your representation is based on how many people live in your state. So, Rhode Island has less people than Virginia. This satisfied everybody, big states and small states, rich states and poor states. What about slavery? How do you deal with slavery? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the Connecticut Compromise again?
The Connecticut Compromise allowed for 2 things. States that have equal representation in the Senate, every state gets 2 senators, but in the House of Representatives, your representation is dependent on how many people live in your state. Okay? Now, when it came to slavery, this was a major bone of contention that divided North from South. And this was not over the morality of slavery. Nobody cared about the morality of slavery yet. It was an issue of politics. In the House of Representatives, you get as much representation as the people that live in your state. Southerners said, we want to count our slave population as part of our total population, and that determines how many people we get in the House of Representatives. Northerners said, you can't do that, because slaves do not vote. You want to consider them property. You can't consider them property and then say they're like people and they should be counted like people. You can either have it one way or the other. You can't have it both. And Southerners said, well, we want it our way, and if you don't get our way, we're not going to sign this document, and you don't have a constitution. So they compromised. And the compromise is the famous and dreadful 3/5 compromise, where Southerners were allowed to count their slave population, each individual slave, as 3/5 of a person, solely for the purposes of determining their representation in the House of Representatives. in a nutshell, Southerners were overrepresented. They were giving political voice to a people, slaves, that had no independent ability to shape politics, which gave more power to Southern whites, their slave masters. Now, this is not just about the House of Representatives, where you have that political imbalance. To elect a president in this country, each state is given a number of electoral college votes, which is determined by your 2 senators plus the number of representatives you have. So in a small state like Delaware, you get 2 senators and minimum 1 representative. So Delaware has 3 electoral college votes. You follow? Yes? Virginia has more. 2 senators, but many more representatives, right? Well, the South is given more representation in the House of Representatives than they really deserve because of this 3/5 slavery compromise. Meaning the South has got more power in the Electoral College to elect the president they want. What does that lead to in real life? From George Washington, the first president of the United States of America, until Abraham Lincoln, the president during the U.S. Civil War, 95% of our presidents were Southern slaveholders. You understand what I'm saying? Because of the over-representation of the South, because of that 3/5 compromise, they were able to pretty much elect the president they wanted. Yeah. I don't know what number he was, but he took office in 1861. He was elected in 60. He took office in 61. He was a 16? All right, 16. Now, you've got the the Constitutional Convention that has finally they got an agreement on this document, the Constitution. They've got an elected president. They've got 2 houses of Congress, checks and balances. Everybody's happy. Is it law yet? No, because you need the majority of the states to individually vote for it and approve it. So now you have a national battle between those supporting the Constitution, known as the Federalists, and those that oppose it, who feel the Constitution gives too much power to the national government, and they want to stay with what they had, or the anti-Federalists. After a good few months of fighting, and I don't mean physical fighting, but I mean debates in the newspaper, debates in the various town squares in the cities, the Federalists, or the supporters of the Constitution, win. And this is why. The Federalists offered a new solution to an existing problem. What was the problem? Weak central government and poverty because of a weak central government. The Federalists said, increase the power of the central government. Give it the power to tax the people, to raise a professional army, a professional navy, to regulate commerce. And we can guarantee that there will be no corruption because there are checks and balances between Congress and the President, and eventually the Supreme Court. The Anti-Federalists had nothing. All they said was, we are afraid of central government, we are afraid it's going to tax us, take away our rights. So let's stick with what we have. But what we have isn't working. We can't keep it. So what do you want to do? You want to stay with what you don't, what we have that doesn't work, or you want to try something new that we guarantee is going to work? I'm still concerned that if you increase the power of the federal government, it's going to become corrupt, like that King George III that we just got rid of. I want to guarantee that my individual rights are not going to be taken away once I give this federal government all this power. Fine. The Federalists come back and they say, you approve this Constitution, and the first 10 amendments will write down literally what the government cannot take away from you. And that becomes our Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, right to bear arms, freedom to not incriminate yourself, etc., etc., etc. The Constitution says what the government can do, President, Congress, the courts. The Bill of Rights says what the government cannot do. This satisfied most people, and the Constitution was ratified by a majority of the states by 1788, November 1788. Bill of Rights was passed in 1791, and the Supreme Court, which was promised, which would act as help in this checks and balances system, was created in 1789. This is the system of government we live with today. Strong central government, internal checks and balances. Congress makes the law, but the president can veto the laws. Congress can override the veto, but they need a supermajority to do so. The president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but he can't declare war. Congress declares war. And the Supreme Court, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Congress, specifically the Senate. What if Congress wants to get rid of the president? Legally, Congress can impeach the president and then convict him of crimes against whatever crimes he committed. And there are procedures for that. Our Constitution is a fairly good way of having a strong central government that has to work together, otherwise it crumbles. And the Supreme Court has the ability to override national and state laws and deem them unconstitutional. Everybody's got to work together. If they don't, you have government paralysis, which is better than the other thing, which is dictatorship. What we have right now at this very moment in this country is government paralysis. We have a Congress of one party, the Republicans, that are passing laws they like. You have a president of another party that says, I'm going to veto those laws because they're too one-sided. And he's going to veto them. Congress can try and override the presidential veto, but in today's divided America, the Republicans will never have enough Democratic votes to override President Obama's veto. So now you have all this time that has been wasted passing laws which the president vetoes. That veto cannot be overridden. You have no laws, just wasted time. Yeah. Because it's a battle of Republicans versus Democrats. Don't give the Democratic president anything he wants, because that's a win for him. The president.
It's not him. He's a representation of
the Democratic Party.
the
The people.
So they're fighting against the people.
Yeah.
And that's right.
Yes.
I don't know that.
Yes. Because it's all about who gets to be the next president of the United States. Because what does the president of the United States get to do? Well, he gets the veto. He gets to appoint the judges. Why is that important? Well, because if you have liberal judges, you have civil rights laws, you have voting rights laws, you have disability laws, you have the right to gay marriage, you have all these things. If you have conservative judges, the Voting Rights Act disappears. The right of women over their own bodies disappears. The right to bear arms is expanded, and gun violence goes up. There is consequences as to who is the president of this country. So, hang on, let me just shut off the recording, and then I'll take any and all questions.